To start this sermon off, I want to preface that what I'll be preaching about today involves some sensitive themes. I'll be sharing about the experiences of soldiers and those who supported them in history, some of which might be difficult to hear. I offer you a gentle reminder to take care of yourself and to notice what comes up for you. Do what you need to best take care of yourself in this time. That being said, I invite you to now close your eyes and to imagine the following scenario. You are a United States service member deployed in modern-day Baghdad, Iraq. Riding in the gunner's seat, you brace in your seat as the Humvee weaves through convoluted streets, past obstacles and rubble. The vehicle comes to an abrupt stop where only feet away sits a stripped, parked car. Through your gun's sights, you see a silhouette holding a cell phone. From your training, you know that improvised explosive devices, also called IEDs, are sometimes detonated by cell phones. You are now faced with an excruciating decision. You must decide in seconds to shoot the silhouette, risking the death of a civilian, or to hold your fire, knowing that your delay might have cost the lives of other soldiers or your own. Please open your eyes. While this opening meditation is fictional and not an actual soldier's account, this type of situation is typical for service members currently serving in modern war zones. War zones that produce ambiguous situations and require split-second decision-making are especially prone to cause moral injuries. Moral injury is a term that has recently emerged to describe the psychological and spiritual wounds that result from this type of decision-making. Moral injury is briefly described as the shame and guilt that a person feels when one commits or witnesses an act that violates their deeply held moral beliefs and values. It involves a sense of feeling tainted to the core of who you are as a person, that your actions have actually come to define you, that there is no hope for forgiveness. It involves a deep spiritual and psychological wrestling that leaves a person's sense of their moral self shattered. Today, my focus is not just on telling the individual stories of soldiers who experienced moral injuries. Instead, I want to focus on the ways in which moral injury relates to our Unitarian Universalist heritage. What is our Unitarian Universalist legacy with moral injury? And what does this mean for who we are as a faith and what role our faith plays in creating a more just, equitable, and compassionate world? My sermon today draws heavily on research I conducted a couple of years ago, exploring moral injury in UU history. While an undergraduate at CSU Monterey Bay, I had the privilege of studying moral injury with Dr. Dan McCannon, the Emerson Senior Lecturer in Divinity at Harvard Divinity School, and one of our leading scholars of UU history. We developed a plan to research moral injury as Unitarians and Universalists encountered it in previous wars. Today, I'd like to unpack the experiences of two of our spiritual ancestors to the Unitarian Universalist tradition, Mary Livermore and James Hosmer. While both Livermore and Hosmer were not military chaplains, they each encountered those who were struggling with moral injuries. In fact, I suggest they even struggled with moral injuries themselves. The language of moral injury simply didn't exist in their time. And because of this, the moral injuries that so many chaplains encountered were so sparsely documented. At times, they simply were just not talked about. Nevertheless, Mary Livermore, a Universalist in the time of the Civil War, did document her encounters with soldiers and their moral injuries. Mary Livermore began her service in the Civil War as a Union Army nurse in 1861. While never in combat, Livermore worked with soldiers in hospitals. As a woman, Livermore was unable to pursue ordination in the early Universalist tradition. Even though she wasn't a minister, however, she did minister to soldiers in the throes of shame as a result of their military service. Livermore, in her diaries, writes about one particular moment where she helped to console a dying soldier. Making her rounds, every single bed occupied by a wounded soldier, she came across a soldier in deep distress. Gasping for air, he suffered from severe pain, with both of his legs amputated, his right and left arms crushed and broken, and being shot twice in the abdomen. Trying to comfort the soldier, Livermore asked him about his fear. And the soldier replied, "I can't live. I know it. There's no chance for me. I'm going to die, and I can't die. I'm afraid to die." In the way of a skilled chaplain, she asked the soldier why he was so afraid to die. "I ain't fit to die," the soldier remarked. "I have lived an awful life. I shall go to hell." Noticing his soul was in deep distress, Livermore told the man of God's ability to forgive all sins. After having the soldier repeat a prayer with her, this spiritual consolation did little to calm him. The soldier asked Livermore to bring a Methodist minister to the ward to receive final absolution. Livermore and the minister did their best to alleviate the soldier's suffering in his final moments. The soldier listened to the chaplain's themes, centering on Christ's love and trust in God to deliver forgiveness to all those who seek it. Praying together in song, the soldier reached a state of peace. And as Livermore writes in her journal, the burden rolled from the boy's heart. They sang as the soldier lay at peace in his bed. Terrified to face the reality of his imminent death, the soldier feared hell and eternal torment. Marked with guilt, the soldier never disclosed what actions were tormenting him so deeply. And this is something that is very characteristic of moral injuries, where sometimes service members, oftentimes not, share their moral injurious experiences only moments before they pass. Livermore, a Universalist, witnessed a soldier wrestling with a moral injury. She herself was even transformed by this experience, unable to eat, sleep, or think for days after, feeling the weight of this spiritual injury. Moving from Livermore's story, another ancestor in our lineage as Unitarian Universalists is James Hosmer, a man who fought for the Union Army in the US Civil War in the 52nd Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteers. A staunch abolitionist, Hosmer felt it was his duty and higher calling to serve in the war. He enlisted as a private in 1862, leaving behind his newly settled ministry as the Unitarian pastor of First Church in Deerfield. From his Civil War journal entries, The Color Guard, Hosmer describes the guilt he feels from witnessing and benefiting from the horrible aspects of the war. He recounts soldiers turned loose to kill livestock, to loot cotton and sugar, and to destroy property. Wasteful of the carcasses, many of the soldiers would take only a fraction of the meat from the animals, leaving the rest to rot and be picked at by buzzards. If the owners of the property offered any resistance, their weapons were taken and they were overpowered. Feeling this guilt, Hosmer writes, I took no part in any active foraging, though I own I was more than once a partaker in the spoils. Even though Hosmer never did any of the looting or pillaging himself, he still felt implicated in the sharing. Government rations of bread and bacon weren't enough to keep the soldiers going through the hard labor and harsh weather conditions. Out of necessity, Hosmer shared in these rations, which he later felt deeply morally injured from. Hosmer later took a more active role in the violence in his journals. He confides to have stolen onions from a garden, assisted in a robbery of a sugar cask, and to have held a candle while livestock were being butchered. Wishing to stay out of the pillaging, Hosmer was forced to violate his conscience and to assist in the looting. Hosmer's guilt from these events followed him throughout the course of the war. Returning from war, Hosmer no longer felt that he was suited for parish ministry. He left the ministry and became a professor. Hosmer wrestled with the moral aftermath of the Civil War with how it had impacted his own theology. He writes, "We thought life was too sacred a thing for man to touch, that God gave it and let him take it away when it is time." In an entry reflecting on his service, Hosmer recognized that he had met soldiers in circumstances that he just couldn't accept the norms of civilian life anymore. The war had changed Hosmer, who was unable to return to his congregation in Deerfield after witnessing so much of the indolence, cruelty, sensuality, and meanness that war had brought. His heart was changed forever. He just couldn't reconcile all that he had witnessed with the normalcy of civilian life. Many soldiers still experience this rift today when they return. And in fact, you may recall earlier from Genesis, our reading reads, "Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Then the man said, 'You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed.'" This is a passage that a Unitarian Universalist military chaplain shared with me as relating to moral injury. Jacob in this passage wrestles with the mysterious man believed to have been an angel or God, asking the man to bless him. If we change the word God to life, the picture becomes even more clear. In turn, Jacob wrestles with life and is given a new name. Our difficult experiences can change our identities, especially those that we have known our whole lives, our very names. Moral injuries leave marks. They force those who suffer from them to wrestle with life and to understand themselves in the wake of new names, feelings, and identities. So what is our Unitarian Universalist legacy with moral injury? Unitarian Universalism's vision of a beloved community, and this is a theology that we hold authentic and sacred to who we are. And it is our responsibility to facilitate healing from war in our communities. Whether we agree with the morality of warfare, we are not excused from the aftermath. We have a responsibility to make space for those in our congregations, also in our hearts, for those who go off to fight on our behalf, who are too often left to wrestle with life alone. In speaking about the beloved community, our legacy doesn't just stop with moral injuries from military service. During this time of pandemic, moral injury has come to the forefront as nurses, doctors, EMTs, and other healthcare workers make difficult and excruciating decisions about life, about who gets to have a ventilator, about whether they are putting their families or their own lives at risk by still going to work. Even more, we continue to see day after day the moral injuries our country carries with its legacies of racism and white supremacy, especially in the wake of Kenosha and the police shooting of Jacob Blake. Our belief that the beloved community is possible is what can give us hope even in these times when the beloved community might seem far as off as ever. As Unitarian Universalists, we need a faith like the early Universalists to remind us of our commitment to this all-encompassing, radically accepting, and reckless love. We need a faith like Mary Livermore's, which shows us that simply listening in times when we often speak can bring peace. We need a faith like James Hosmer, a faith in the goodness of people, the goodness of one another, and in our own abilities to work toward making this world a more just place. May you encounter this rich Unitarian Universalist legacy of love. Our faith professes a love that knows no bounds, a love that extends to everyone, a love that knows no borders, and something that we do to those even that we most deeply disagree with. May you be rooted in this love and continue on our Unitarian Universalist legacy as peacemakers, as lovers, as justice seekers, and as action takers. May it be so, and amen. I invite you now to join in singing our closing hymn, which we'll be sharing, Lean on Me. The lyrics will be posted in our chat.